My name is Beverly, and I'm 28 years old. I thought I knew my family inside and out, especially my younger sister Janet. We'd shared everything growing up, from clothes to secrets to dreams about our future weddings. But 3 days before what was supposed to be my dream wedding, I caught Janet in my wedding dress, twirling in front of the mirror like she was the bride. What she didn't know was that I'd already discovered her months-long affair with my fiancé Harold. And what she really didn't know was that I'd gotten married to him that very morning at the courthouse. When she gasped and saw me standing in the doorway, I just smiled sweetly and said the words that would change everything forever. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. Hit that like button if you're ready for some serious sister drama. And don't forget to subscribe because trust me, you won't want to miss how this revenge story unfolds. Now let's get into the juiciest family betrayal you've ever heard. Harold and I had what everyone called the perfect love story. We met 3 years ago at a little coffee shop on 16th Street in downtown Denver. I was working on a presentation for my marketing coordinator job when this gorgeous guy with dark brown hair and the most genuine smile accidentally knocked over his latte, and it went everywhere, including all over my laptop. Most people would have been furious, but something about the way he immediately started apologizing and frantically grabbing napkins made me laugh instead of scream. He insisted on buying me a new laptop, which I refused, but I did let him buy me coffee every day for a week as an apology. By the third day, we were talking for hours about everything from our favorite hiking trails in the Rocky Mountains to our shared obsession with cooking shows. Harold worked as a financial advisor and had this incredible passion for outdoor photography. He'd show me pictures he'd taken of sunrise over the mountains, and I'd share stories about the marketing campaigns I was developing for local businesses. Our first real date was a weekend hiking trip to Mount Evans. Harold packed this elaborate picnic with homemade sandwiches, fresh fruit, and even a thermos of hot chocolate for when we reached the summit. We spent the entire day talking about our childhoods, our dreams, our fears. He told me about growing up as an only child and always wanting a big family. I shared stories about Janet and me, how we'd always been each other's best friends despite our 3-year age gap. Those early months were magical. Harold would surprise me with flowers at my office, just because it was Tuesday. We'd spend Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, picking out ingredients for elaborate dinners we cooked together in his downtown apartment. He had this tiny kitchen, but somehow we'd managed to create these incredible meals while dancing to jazz music and drinking wine. Sunday afternoons were for exploring new neighborhoods, finding hidden bookstores and vintage shops. Meeting each other's families felt natural and easy. Harold came to our family's Thanksgiving dinner and immediately fit in. He helped my dad Robert fix the broken garbage disposal, complimented my mom Marie on her famous stuffing recipe, and spent an hour looking through Janet's photography portfolio, giving her genuine encouragement about pursuing it professionally. Janet seemed to love him immediately, always asking when he was coming over next, volunteering to set an extra place at dinner whenever we visited. The proposal happened exactly 18 months after we met, during a concert at Red Rocks Amphitheater. We were watching my favorite band play under the stars, with the Denver city lights twinkling below us. During the encore, Harold got down on one knee right there in our seats. The ring was perfect, a classic solitaire with a band that caught the stage lights beautifully. Everyone around us started cheering, and the lead singer actually noticed and dedicated the next song to us. Planning our wedding became a full-time obsession. We booked the historic Brown Palace Hotel for the reception, with its gorgeous atrium and crystal chandeliers. I spent weeks touring venues, tasting different cake flavors, meeting with florists to design the perfect bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. Harold was surprisingly involved in the details, having opinions about everything from the color of the napkins to the style of the invitations. Janet was incredibly supportive throughout the entire process. She volunteered for every wedding-related task, from addressing invitations in her beautiful handwriting to researching photographers and caterers. She'd spend hours with me looking through bridal magazines, helping me choose between different styles of centerpieces, and debating the merits of various wedding cake flavors. When I found my dress at an exclusive boutique in Cherry Creek, Janet was the one who started crying before I did, saying I looked like a princess. She seemed genuinely excited about becoming Harold's sister-in-law, often joking about how lucky she was to gain such an amazing brother. Janet would bring Harold his favorite cookies when she stopped by his apartment, and she'd always ask thoughtful questions about his work and his photography hobby. I thought it was sweet how much effort she was putting into building a relationship with the man who was going to be part of our family forever. Looking back now, I realize I was completely blind to what was really happening. I saw Janet's enthusiasm as sisterly love and support. I interpreted her interest in Harold as her way of welcoming him into our tight-knit family. We'd always shared everything, from clothes to crushes to career advice. It never occurred to me that my baby sister might want to share my fiancé too. The first warning signs were so subtle that I almost missed them completely. It started with little things that seemed innocent enough at the time. During our weekly family dinners at my parents' house, Janet began paying unusual attention to Harold's stories about work and his weekend photography expeditions. She'd laugh just a little too hard at his jokes, even the ones that weren't particularly funny. Her hand would linger on his arm when she passed him dishes, and she'd find excuses to sit next to him at the dinner table. I noticed Janet started dressing differently when she knew Harold would be around. Instead of her usual casual jeans and sweaters, she'd show up in form-fitting dresses and higher heels than she typically wore. She'd spend extra time on her makeup and hair, claiming she was trying out new looks for fun. When I complimented her on looking especially nice, she'd brush it off with comments like, "Oh, this old thing," or "I just felt like making an effort today." At my bridal shower, which Janet had helped organize, she made several comments that seemed odd at the time. While I was opening gifts, she kept saying things like, "Harold is so incredibly lucky, and I wonder what it feels like to be loved like that by someone so wonderful." When someone asked her if she was seeing anyone special, Janet got this wistful look and said she was waiting for the right person while glancing in Harold's direction. The situation escalated when Janet volunteered to help Harold pick up our wedding rings from the jeweler downtown. It seemed like a practical offer, since she worked part-time at a boutique nearby and could easily stop by during her lunch break. What should have been a simple 20-minute errand somehow turned into a 3-hour adventure. When they finally returned, Janet was practically glowing, going on and on about how romantic the rings were and how Harold must really love me to spend so much money on such beautiful diamonds. Harold seemed a bit uncomfortable with Janet's enthusiasm, which I attributed to typical guy awkwardness about discussing feelings and romance. He kept trying to change the subject, but Janet would steer the conversation back to the rings, the wedding plans, and how excited she was about the big day. She asked detailed questions about our honeymoon plans, our future house hunting goals, and even our thoughts about having children. Then Janet started showing up at Harold's apartment, unannounced. The first time, she claimed she was in the neighborhood after meeting a friend for coffee and thought she'd stop by to say hello. She brought a plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies, saying they were a thank you gift for making her sister so happy. Harold mentioned it casually, not seeming bothered by the visit, so I didn't think much of it. But the unannounced visits became more frequent. Janet would drop by with wedding favors that needed to be stored temporarily, or she'd offer to help Harold organize his photography equipment, or she'd bring him dinner when she'd made too much food at home. Each time Harold would mention these visits in passing, usually while we were watching television or getting ready for bed. He never seemed secretive about them, which made me think everything was innocent. The breaking point came during one of our regular movie nights at Harold's place. I was looking for the remote control that had fallen between the couch cushions when my fingers found something unexpected. It was a small gold earring, delicate and expensive looking. I recognized it immediately as one of Janet's favorites, a pair she'd gotten for her last birthday. When I asked Harold about it, he looked genuinely surprised and said Janet must have lost it when she stopped by earlier that week to drop off some wedding programs that needed his approval. I tried to remember if Janet had been wearing those earrings recently, but I couldn't recall seeing them on her in weeks. Something about the whole situation felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what was bothering me. Harold's explanation seemed reasonable, and Janet losing an earring wasn't exactly scandalous behavior. Still, a nagging feeling settled in my stomach, like a tiny alarm bell going off in the back of my mind. When I mentioned finding the earring to Janet the next day, she seemed flustered and quickly said she'd been wondering where it had gone. She thanked me for finding it and said she'd been looking everywhere. But her reaction seemed overly dramatic for such a simple situation. She kept talking about how much those earrings meant to her and how careless she'd been to lose one. The more she talked, the more uncomfortable I became, though I still couldn't articulate exactly why. Over the following weeks, my discomfort grew into genuine suspicion as I began noticing changes in Harold's behavior that I couldn't ignore. He started working late more frequently, claiming his boss had assigned him several high-priority clients who required evening meetings and weekend consultations. As a financial advisor, irregular hours weren't completely unusual, but the sudden increase in late nights felt different somehow. Harold became secretive about his phone calls, stepping out onto the balcony or into the bathroom whenever his phone rang. When I asked who was calling, he'd give vague answers like work stuff or just a client with questions. He'd also started keeping his phone face down on tables and counters, something he'd never done before. Previously, Harold had been completely open about his communications, often showing me funny texts from friends or asking my opinion on work-related messages. While doing laundry, I found receipts in Harold's pants pockets for expensive dinners at restaurants we'd never visited together. There were charges for bottles of wine that cost more than we typically spent on entire meals, appetizers we didn't usually order, and desserts from upscale establishments downtown. When I asked about these receipts, Harold explained they were business dinners with potential clients, part of his strategy for expanding his customer base. His explanation made sense on the surface, but something in his voice didn't ring true. Harold had always been excited to tell me about successful client meetings and potential business opportunities. Now, when I asked for details about these expensive dinners, he'd give minimal information and quickly change the subject. He'd say things like, "Oh, you know how these business meals go," or just boring financial planning discussions, without providing any of the usual enthusiastic details. Meanwhile, I started paying closer attention to Janet's behavior and noticed some puzzling changes. She had acquired several pieces of new jewelry, including a delicate gold bracelet that looked far more expensive than anything she could afford on her part-time boutique salary. When I complimented her on it, she said it was a gift from a friend but wouldn't elaborate despite my follow-up questions. Janet also seemed to have more spending money lately, suggesting dinners at nice restaurants and offering to pay for coffee when we met up. Janet began asking strangely specific questions about Harold's schedule and preferences. She'd want to know what time he usually got home from work, which coffee shops he preferred, what his favorite restaurants were, and even details about his photography equipment and weekend hiking plans. When I asked why she was so interested in Harold's routine, she'd claim she was trying to be a good future sister-in-law and wanted to understand his interests better. During a family barbecue at my parents' house, I caught Janet and Harold in what appeared to be an intense private conversation by the garden shed, away from the rest of the family. They were standing closer together than seemed necessary, and Harold's hand was touching Janet's shoulder in a gesture that looked more intimate than brotherly. When they noticed me approaching, they immediately stepped apart and began talking loudly about the weather and how nice my mom's flower garden looked this year. Janet quickly made a joke about asking Harold for advice about some guy she'd been dating, but this was the first I'd heard about Janet seeing anyone romantically. Throughout the entire engagement period, she'd claimed to be focusing on her career and not interested in dating. When I pressed her for details about this mysterious boyfriend, she became evasive and said it was, quote, still too early to talk about and probably won't amount to anything anyway. The final piece of evidence came when I was taking Harold's jacket to the dry cleaner and found a folded piece of paper in the inside pocket. It was clearly a love letter, written in handwriting that looked disturbingly familiar. The letter wasn't signed, but it contained intimate details about Harold that only someone very close to him would know. It mentioned his habit of humming while making coffee, his scar from a childhood bike accident, and his fear of heights that he rarely admitted to anyone. Most disturbing were the letter's references to sneaking around, and when we can finally be together, and I hate having to pretend I don't love you when she's around. The handwriting had the same distinctive loops and flourishes that I'd admired when Janet addressed our wedding invitations. My heart pounded as I read phrases like, "Last night was incredible, and I can't wait until we don't have to hide anymore." Sitting in my car outside the dry cleaner, staring at this letter that seemed to confirm my worst fears, I felt my entire world shifting beneath me. The man I was planning to marry in less than 2 months was apparently having an affair with my own sister. The sister who had helped me plan every detail of our wedding, who had cried when I tried on my dress, who had been my maid of honor and closest confidant my entire life. Instead of confronting Harold and Janet immediately, I decided to conduct my own investigation to gather undeniable proof of their betrayal. I needed to be absolutely certain before I destroyed my relationship with both my fiancé and my sister. and I wanted to make sure I had all the facts before deciding how to handle the situation. I started by examining Harold's social media activity more carefully. Going through his Instagram and Facebook accounts, I noticed he'd been liking all of Janet's photos, including ones she posted late at night or early in the morning. Some of his likes appeared within minutes of Janet posting, suggesting he was actively watching her social media activity. He'd also started commenting on her photos with compliments that seemed overly enthusiastic for a future brother-in-law, using phrases like gorgeous as always and absolutely stunning with heart-eye emojis. To get a more complete picture, I created a fake social media account using a stock photo and generic name. From this anonymous account, I could see interactions between Harold and Janet that might be hidden from my main profile. I discovered they'd been having extended conversations in the comments sections of each other's posts, sharing inside jokes and making plans that they'd later delete. There were references to our favorite spot and next time we should try the dessert that clearly indicated they'd been spending time together without me. I began tracking both Harold and Janet's locations more systematically, noting patterns in their schedules and whereabouts. When Harold claimed to be working late, I'd call his office and discover he'd left hours earlier. When Janet said she was out with friends from work, I'd check her coworkers' social media and find no evidence of group outings or gatherings. Most suspiciously, these unexplained absences often coincided perfectly with each other. My best friend Donna became my partner in this investigation after I confided my suspicions to her. Donna had always been protective of me and was furious when I showed her the love letter and explained the strange behavior I'd been witnessing. She immediately agreed to help me gather more evidence, using her own network of friends and acquaintances to keep an eye on Harold and Janet around town. Donna's assistance proved invaluable when she remembered seeing Harold and Janet together at Bistro Vendôme, an upscale French restaurant downtown, about 3 weeks earlier. She'd been there for a business lunch and noticed them sitting in a corner booth, holding hands across the table and looking very much like a couple on a romantic date. At the time, Donna had assumed there must be some innocent explanation and hadn't mentioned it to me, but now the sighting took on a much more sinister meaning. I decided to visit Bistro Vendôme myself to see what I could learn from the staff. The hostess and several waiters remembered Harold and Janet as regular customers who always requested the same corner booth for privacy. One particularly talkative waiter mentioned what a lovely couple they made and how they always seemed so happy together, sharing desserts and lingering over wine long after other customers had left. He even commented on how the woman always wore beautiful jewelry and how the man was clearly crazy about her. This confirmation from restaurant staff felt like a punch to the stomach, but it also provided the concrete evidence I needed to prove the affair was real and ongoing. Armed with this information, I continued building my case by documenting other suspicious activities and gathering additional proof of their deception. I found more evidence in small details that suddenly made perfect sense. Harold's spare house key had disappeared from my keychain, but I noticed it hanging from Janet's keyring when she visited our parents. Both Harold and Janet had started drinking the same specialty coffee blend, an expensive imported variety that neither of them had shown interest in before. Harold's apartment contained a second coffee mug that matched one I'd seen Janet drinking from, and both mugs were clearly part of a romantic his and hers set. Text message notifications on Harold's phone became more frequent and occurred at odd hours, including late nights and early mornings when he'd quickly grab his phone and step away to read them privately. When I asked who was texting so urgently, Harold would claim it was work-related or dismiss it as spam, but his body language suggested he was lying. He'd become jumpy and nervous whenever his phone buzzed, completely different from his previously relaxed attitude about communications. As my investigation progressed, I realized that Harold and Janet had been conducting their affair for months, possibly since shortly after Harold and I got engaged. They'd been meeting regularly, sharing intimate moments, and planning some kind of future together while pretending to support my wedding preparations. The depth of their deception was staggering, and I found myself alternating between rage and heartbreak as I uncovered each new piece of evidence. But rather than falling apart or confronting them immediately, I began planning my revenge. If Harold and Janet thought they could betray me and get away with it, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I was going to turn their deception against them in the most spectacular way possible, and I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of people they really were. 3 days before our scheduled wedding ceremony, I decided to visit my childhood home to check on my wedding dress one final time. The gown had been stored in my old bedroom closet at my parents' house, carefully preserved in a protective garment bag since the final fitting 2 weeks earlier. I wanted to make sure everything was perfect and see the dress one more time before the big day, or at least what everyone else thought was going to be the big day. I used my key to enter the house quietly, assuming no one would be home since my parents were both at work and Janet should have been at her job at the boutique. The house felt peaceful and familiar as I climbed the stairs to the second floor, past the family photos that chronicled Janet and me growing up together. Those pictures showed two sisters who had always been best friends, sharing birthday parties and Christmas mornings, supporting each other through school challenges and teenage heartbreaks. As I approached my old bedroom, I heard soft music playing from inside, which immediately struck me as strange. The melody was At Last by Etta James, one of the songs Harold and I had chosen for our wedding reception playlist. I paused outside the door, listening carefully and trying to figure out who might be in my room and why they'd be playing our wedding music. I carefully pushed the door open just enough to peer inside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Janet was standing in front of my full-length mirror, wearing my wedding dress. But she wasn't just trying it on out of curiosity or sisterly affection. She was performing an elaborate fantasy, practicing walking down an imaginary aisle with careful, measured steps and a radiant smile on her face. Janet was holding my bridal bouquet of white roses and baby's breath, the exact arrangement I'd spent hours designing with our florist. She'd lift the bouquet to her face, inhaling the fragrance and closing her eyes as if savoring a perfect moment. Then she'd extend her left hand, admiring the way my engagement ring looked on her finger, turning her hand to catch the light just as I'd done countless times since Harold proposed. I watched in horrified fascination as Janet whispered what sounded like wedding vows under her breath. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I could see her lips moving and her eyes shining with tears of joy. She was completely lost in her fantasy, imagining herself as the bride in what was supposed to be my wedding. Every gesture was rehearsed and deliberate, as if she'd been practicing this scene for weeks or even months. Janet practiced her surprised and delighted face in the mirror, probably imagining Harold waiting for her at the altar. She'd gasp softly and bring her hands to her cheeks, then beam with happiness as if Harold was telling her how beautiful she looked. She even practiced the moment when the officiant would pronounce them husband and wife, puckering her lips and leaning forward to kiss the air where Harold would be standing. The most devastating part was watching Janet run her hands lovingly over the intricate beadwork I'd spent months selecting. She traced the delicate embroidery with her fingertips, admiring the way the crystals caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. She trailed slowly to see how the cathedral train flowed behind her, adjusting the fabric carefully to create the perfect silhouette. This wasn't innocent curiosity about how the dress would look on her. This was a full rehearsal of my wedding day, with Janet starring as the bride. She'd clearly been planning this fantasy for a long time, probably dreaming about the moment when she could take my place as Harold's wife. Every detail had been considered, from the way she held the bouquet to the expression of pure bliss on her face. Janet suddenly noticed movement in the doorway and spun around to face me, her face instantly draining of all color. The bouquet fell from her hands, scattering rose petals across my childhood bedroom floor. Her mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to find words, looking like a child caught stealing cookies from the kitchen counter. She started stammering excuses about just wanting to make sure the dress still fit properly, claiming she was concerned about last-minute alterations and wanted to check the measurements. But I could see the guilt written all over her face, along with terror at being discovered in such a compromising position. Her hands shook as she tried to smooth down the dress skirt, and tears began forming in her eyes. Instead of screaming or crying or demanding explanations, I felt an unexpected sense of calm wash over me. All the pieces of the puzzle had finally clicked into place, and I could see the complete picture of Janet and Harold's betrayal. But more importantly, I was ready to execute the revenge plan I'd been developing for weeks. This moment was actually perfect for what I had in mind. I smiled sweetly at my sister and stepped into the room, closing the door behind me. "You look absolutely beautiful in that dress, Janet," I said in the most genuine tone I could manage. "It fits you perfectly. You should keep wearing it for a few more minutes. because I have something really important to tell you. I walked calmly across my childhood bedroom and sat down on the edge of my old twin bed. The same bed where Janet and I had shared countless late-night conversations about boys, dreams, and our future weddings. The irony of this moment wasn't lost on me as I looked at my sister standing there in my wedding dress, caught in the act of literally trying to steal my life. "That dress really does suit you well," I said conversationally, as if we were having a normal sisterly chat. "Have you been planning this moment for long?" The whole performance was quite elaborate. I especially liked the part where you practiced kissing Harold at the altar. Janet's face crumpled as she realized there was no point in denying what I'd witnessed. She started crying, makeup running down her cheeks as she begged me to forgive her. "Beverly, please. You have to understand, this isn't what it looks like," she sobbed, even though we both knew exactly what it looked like. "I was just curious about how the dress would fit, and I got carried away with some silly fantasies. You know how I am with romantic movies and fairy tales." I let her ramble through increasingly desperate explanations before cutting her off with a gentle but firm voice. "Janet, I know about the affair. I've known for weeks now. I know about your secret dinners at Bistro Vendôme, your late-night text messages, your visits to Harold's apartment when I'm not there. I found the love letter you wrote him, the one where you talked about sneaking around and waiting until you could finally be together." The blood drained from Janet's face as she realized her carefully constructed lies were falling apart. She sank onto my desk chair, still wearing my wedding dress, and put her head in her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were red and swollen, and she looked younger than her 25 years. "How long have you known?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wedding music still playing from her phone. "Long enough to gather all the evidence I needed," I replied matter-of-factly. "Long enough to understand that this wasn't some sudden moment of weakness or a mistake that just happened. You and Harold have been planning this for months, probably hoping I'd discover you and call off the wedding so you could be together without feeling guilty about it." Janet started offering pathetic excuses, claiming Harold had pursued her first and she'd just been lonely and flattered by the attention. She insisted she never meant to hurt me and that the whole thing had spiraled out of control before she knew what was happening. According to Janet's version of events, she was just an innocent victim of Harold's manipulation and her own emotional vulnerability. I listened to her sob story with growing disgust, amazed by her ability to paint herself as the victim in a situation where she'd systematically betrayed her own sister. She claimed Harold had told her he wasn't really happy with me, that our relationship lacked passion, and that he'd only proposed because he felt obligated after dating me for so long. She said he'd convinced her that I'd be better off without him, and that she was actually doing me a favor by showing me his true character. "Even if all of that were true," I said coldly, "you're still my sister. You could have talked to me about your concerns instead of sneaking around behind my back for months. You could have encouraged me to have honest conversations with Harold about our relationship, instead of seducing him yourself." Janet had no response to that logic, because there was no justification for what she'd done. She'd chosen betrayal over honesty, selfishness over sisterly loyalty, and fantasy over reality. Now she was about to face the consequences of those choices, in a way she never could have imagined. I reached into my purse and pulled out an official-looking document. "I have something to show you, Janet. Something that's going to change everything." I unfolded the paper and held it up so she could see the official seal in formal language clearly. "This is a marriage certificate. Harold and I got married this morning at the courthouse." Janet stared at the document in shock, her mouth falling open as she processed what I was telling her. "That's impossible," she stammered. "The wedding isn't until Saturday. You've been planning this big ceremony for months. Harold would have told me if you were eloping. Harold has no idea I know about your affair," I explained patiently. "I told him I wanted to surprise everyone by getting married at the courthouse and then having our reception as planned, just as a celebration rather than the actual ceremony. I said I was tired of all the wedding stress and wanted to focus on the party instead of the legal formalities. He was actually relieved to avoid all the ceremony pressure and agreed immediately." I showed Janet the photos from our simple courthouse wedding that morning. Donna and her husband had served as our witnesses, and we'd taken pictures on the courthouse steps afterward. Harold looked genuinely happy in the photos, probably thinking he was getting the best of both worlds. A simple, stress-free ceremony and a big party with all our friends and family. "So you see, Janet, all your scheming and planning has been for nothing. Harold is already my husband, legally and officially. Your little fantasy about taking my place as his bride is never going to happen." I stood up and walked closer to where she sat frozen in my wedding dress. But don't worry, I'm not done with either of you yet. Janet's eyes widened with terror as she realized I had something more planned. What are you going to do? She whispered. I smiled the same sweet smile I'd given her when I first walked into the room. Tomorrow at our reception, I'm going to tell everyone the truth about what you and Harold have been doing, in front of all our family and friends, with pictures and evidence and audio recordings of your romantic conversations. Everyone is going to know exactly what kind of people you both really are. The wedding reception the next evening unfolded exactly as I'd planned, though none of the guests knew they were about to witness the most dramatic family scandal in our history. I arrived at the Brown Palace Hotel, looking absolutely stunning in a red silk dress instead of the traditional white reception gown everyone expected. The color choice was deliberate. Red for passion, for anger, for the blood that was about to be spilled metaphorically across the elegant ballroom floor. Harold was already greeting guests when I walked in, looking handsome in his black tuxedo and completely oblivious to what was coming. He kissed me on the cheek and complimented my dress choice, saying I looked more beautiful than ever. Janet stood nearby in her pale blue maid of honor dress, her face still puffy from crying the night before, but trying to maintain a normal appearance for the sake of our family and friends. I had arranged for a special slideshow presentation to be set up with the hotel's audiovisual equipment, ostensibly to share romantic photos and memories from Harold's and my relationship. The hotel staff had been incredibly helpful in setting up the large screens and sound system, not knowing they were facilitating the most spectacular public breakup in their venue's history. After dinner and the traditional toasts, I stood up and asked for everyone's attention. The ballroom fell quiet as our 150 guests turned to face me, expecting a heartfelt speech about love and gratitude. Instead, I began by announcing that Harold and I had actually gotten married the previous morning at the courthouse, which caused a wave of surprised murmurs and confused looks among our family and friends. I know this might seem unusual, I continued, but Harold and I decided we wanted to have a private ceremony just for us, and then celebrate with all of you at this beautiful party. However, there's something else I need to share with everyone here tonight, something that changes everything about this celebration. I signaled the hotel staff to begin the slideshow, and the large screens around the ballroom lit up with images I'd carefully compiled over the past few weeks. The first photos showed Harold and Janet together at Bistro Vendôme, clearly on romantic dates rather than innocent family meetings. The restaurant's security cameras had provided excellent footage of them holding hands, sharing intimate conversations, and behaving like lovers rather than future in-laws. The room erupted in gasps and shocked exclamations as more evidence appeared on the screens. I had photos of Harold and Janet entering and leaving his apartment building together, pictures of them shopping for matching jewelry, and screenshots of their romantic social media interactions that they thought were private. Each image was time-stamped and dated, showing a clear pattern of deception that had been going on for months. But the most damaging evidence came when I played audio recordings I'd made of Harold and Janet's phone conversations. Using a recording app on my phone, I'd captured several of their late-night calls where they discussed their feelings for each other, made plans for secret meetings, and even talked about what they'd do after my wedding was called off. Their voices filled the ballroom as they expressed their love for each other and their impatience with having to sneak around. Harold's face went white as his own voice echoed through the elegant reception space, telling Janet how much he loved her and how he couldn't wait to be free of his obligation to marry me. Janet had fled the ballroom in tears during the first few minutes of my presentation, unable to face the judgment of our family and friends. She ran past tables full of people she'd known her entire life, people who had watched her grow up and trusted her to be a loyal, loving sister. The room fell into stunned silence as the full scope of the betrayal became clear to everyone present. My parents sat frozen at the head table, their faces showing a mixture of shock, disappointment, and heartbreak. Harold tried to deny the evidence at first, claiming the photos were taken out of context and the recordings were somehow fabricated, but the proof was overwhelming and undeniable. As guests began to process what they'd witnessed, people started leaving in disgust and disappointment. Some stopped to offer me words of support and condolences, while others simply gathered their belongings and departed without comment. The elegant reception I'd spent months planning dissolved into chaos and recrimination, exactly as I'd intended. Harold was left standing alone at the head table as friends and family members confronted him about his behavior. His groomsmen, who had known him for years and respected him as a man of integrity, were particularly vocal in their condemnation. Several of them removed their boutonnieres and dropped them on the floor before walking out, making it clear that their friendship with Harold was over. My parents eventually approached me with tears in their eyes, devastated by what had happened, but ultimately supportive of my decision to expose the truth rather than live a lie. My mother hugged me tightly and whispered that she was proud of me for having the courage to stand up for myself, even though it meant destroying relationships with two people she loved dearly. I filed for annulment the following Monday morning, citing fraud and adultery as grounds for dissolving our one-day marriage. Since Harold had married me while carrying on an affair with my sister, the court readily agreed that our marriage had been entered into under false pretenses. I kept all the wedding gifts since they had been given to celebrate my happiness, and I sold my engagement ring to fund a solo trip to Europe where I could heal and rediscover myself away from the drama and betrayal. Harold lost his job within 2 weeks when word of his behavior spread through Denver's tight-knit financial services community. Apparently, clients don't want to trust their money to someone who can't even be faithful to his own wife. Janet moved to Seattle shortly after the reception scandal, unable to face the social ostracism and family disappointment that followed her actions. She sent me a long letter of apology several months later, but I returned it unopened because I wasn't ready to forgive her betrayal. The experience taught me that sometimes the people closest to you can inflict the deepest wounds, but that doesn't mean you should accept betrayal quietly or try to preserve relationships at any cost. I learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, and I developed the strength to demand the respect and loyalty I deserve from the people in my life. 2 years later, I'm in a healthy relationship with a man named Thomas who values honesty and integrity above all else. He knows the entire story of my first marriage and has proven through his actions that he's nothing like Harold. We've built our relationship on a foundation of trust and open communication, and I'm finally beginning to believe in love again. The betrayal was devastating at the time, but it ultimately freed me from a marriage that would have been built on lies and deception. Harold and Janet taught me valuable lessons about recognizing red flags and standing up for myself, even when it means making difficult and painful decisions. I'm stronger now than I was before, more selective about who I allow into my inner circle, and more confident in my ability to handle whatever challenges life throws my way. If there's one thing I want everyone to take away from my story, it's this: never ignore your instincts when something feels wrong in your relationships. Pay attention to the warning signs, gather your evidence, and don't be afraid to demand the honesty and loyalty you deserve. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who don't value you enough to treat you with basic respect and faithfulness. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have confronted them privately or exposed them publicly like I did? Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, because I'd love to hear how other people have handled similar situations. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life drama and life lessons. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who might need to hear about the importance of standing up for yourself and demanding better treatment from the people who claim to love you. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I hope it helps someone else recognize their own worth and find the courage to choose themselves over toxic relationships. Remember, you deserve honesty, loyalty, and genuine love, and never let anyone convince you to settle for less than that.